Good evening, everyone. Is that on? Is that on? Good evening, everyone. Oh, thank you so much. My name is Dion Antoje, and I am the Director of Graduate Studies in Studio Art. And I am so happy to welcome you to the first of 3 evenings of our MFA artist lectures. Lovely. This lecture series is an opportunity for second year MFA candidates to share their work and research in advance of their thesis exhibitions in the spring of 2025 in February, March, and April. The layout for this evening and the other 2 evenings is that each artist will speak for about 30 minutes, 15 minutes for Q&A, and we'll take it from there. I will give a special shout out to those on Zoom. We will be taking questions from the chat portion for the Q&A portion, so please at that time, if you have a question, my colleague Erin Collier is kindly going to be on the Zoom chat, checking in the questions and relaying. Otherwise, in the room, I'll be walking around with a mic to take your questions. Great. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first artist. Grace McIntyre-Willis is a new media artist working with 3D ceramic printing, biology, and 2D design to explore morphology, the visualization of unseen systems, and more than human intelligence. In addition to their course load as an MFA student, they are the manager of the newly founded Digital Ceramics Lab created by the School of Architecture and the Newcomb Art Department. This past summer, their research took them to a remote ecological research station in Ecuador, where they created 3D models of seeds being used for reforestation in the Mache Chindul Reserve. Grace received their BFA in digital art from the University of West Florida in 2022 and will graduate from Tulane University with an MFA in digital art in 2025. Please join me in welcoming Grace.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be surrounded by smiling faces of people that I've met while I've been at Tulane and then my family. Thank you to everyone in the Zoom chat, to my Gigi and my dad and my Aunt Tanya. I hope you can hear everything and enjoy this talk. This is a special time to be able to have like 35 minutes to tell you guys about my practice is kind of wild. To have all of your attention is cool. So I hope this is fun for you and interesting. I'm going to be telling you guys about the content that I'm working with and the subject matter that I'm working with and just everything since I've gotten into the MFA program. I'm not going to really go back in time too much. So, okay, now we're good. So I'm a second year MFA candidate in digital art. I really categorize the work that I do as new media because I'm working with so many different mediums. I work in technology. I also employ biological systems in my work and 2D illustration. And so most of this is in an effort to speak about this larger idea of interconnectivity I feel like we all have to one another in our three-dimensional space, as humans living on Earth. And then also these unseen systems that we may not be so aware of, like microbes in the air and what is beneath our feet, kind of perpetuating these ecological systems that keep us alive. And so I wanted to start off with a quote by a renowned evolutionary biologist, Lynn Margulis. She says, "No matter how much of our own species preoccupies us, life is a far wider system. Life is an incredibly complex interdependence of matter and energy among millions of species beyond and within our skin." And this just prompts me to reflect upon the fact that our bodies are made up of trillions of microbes, microbial life. And although it may seem as though we are individuals, we are actually walking communities at all times. I mean, that's how we exist. Those systems are providing us life. And so this quote really, for me, is important in framing the context of my work. And you may wonder, why is this so important to you? Why are you thinking about this now? As a young adult at the ripe age of 23, I have existential crises all the time. I'm constantly like, why are we here? What are we doing? Like, what's the point of all of this? I'm not necessarily religious. I'm more just like spiritual and exploring, very interested in what biology can tell us in an abstract way, but also in a scientific way. And so I think that what subconsciously it planted this seed for me was, as a child, okay, I think this is going to happen every time somebody joins. I'm going to have to like click just to let you guys know. Whenever I was a child, I lived in northwestern Florida, out in the country, around a place called Allentown. My dad and my mom bought 5 acres of land whenever I was younger. And it was an old peanut farm. So it was kind of far out. We didn't have like many neighbors, especially like no kids to play with. So I was also always playing with like the goats or the chickens, and we had a pony and a cow and guinea pigs and pigeons, just like anything that could be domesticated. My family had, and we spent a lot of time with them. I was constantly just outside running around, building little things, trapping the chickens with like a crate and a stick and a rope, and just like doing stuff like that, which was really fun. But when I wasn't inside, here's a little photo of me looking into a birdhouse, which I think is kind of wild. When I wasn't doing that outside, I was inside. My dad did aquaculture before I was born. He was installing different aquariums around the state of Florida in hotels or private residents. And so we had this saltwater aquarium in our home, which I was absolutely obsessed with as a kid. I was constantly just sitting next to it, reading all of these different books that my dad had about different aquatic species, and just peering over at like all the different forms. I mean, it's kind of intense looking at it. And I think that richness, that visual richness, has just sat with me. The sea apple you see on the left here, type of sea cucumber, and all of its long kind of antennas pulling in food. The anemone, the pajama fish over here on the right, Nemo and Dory were always there. The sea urchin, scallops, things like that. The bristleworm in the rocks, especially because it was live rocks, so you'd find like often little worms were crawling around. I was just like looking at it all of the time. Here's a little video my mom sent me of the sea apple eating, which when you speed it up, it kind of looks like it's like licking its fingers, like sticking, which is kind of wild. All of this to say, as I got a little older into maybe elementary school, I started getting really into drawing, and I found this portfolio from when I was in 4th grade, which is like crazy to think about. So in 4th grade, I was in the silly bands, of course, to speak of the time. But in 4th grade, I was thinking about mythical creatures. I was thinking about hybridized forms, like how are things coming together? What is this like? Of course, it wasn't that intense. I was more just like having a good time as a 4th grader. But to look back on this and think, wow, I've always been interested in biology. I've always been interested in this like surrealist quality that we kind of have subconsciously, like creating new things and exploring what isn't in our 3D reality. And as well, just kind of like this remixing. This guy's on Instagram, I don't know his name, but I love these videos of like the AI transformations about how our matter on Earth is so remixable, and we're all kind of made of similar ingredients, as humans, but as well, just like matter comes in so many different shapes and forms. And so when I got to grad school, I was having another existential crisis and was thinking a lot about the evolution of biological form over time. And this led me to create this, like people say, crime scene type map in my studio on the wall, but it was really helpful for me. And essentially, I was mapping out homologous structures, which are similar structures in different species that they look similar, but they may not serve the same purpose. And so like perhaps like the roach and the shrimp, or like the shelf polyphore fungi and the shelf coral, all of these different like interconnecting webs and strings that are happening over time. And with that, also thinking about the smaller geometries that comprise those larger objects, thinking about antennas and like mouths and different patterns as like puzzle pieces to this much larger scheme of life that we live in. And one of my favorite things to think about is fractals. Fractals are all around us all of the time. And so I put a few here: the slime mold fractaling out to find food, the deer antlers growing into fractals, veins fractaling in your skin. I mean, they're all over, and we'll get a little more into that later. I do all of this work using a 3D ProtterBot, a 3D ceramic printer. And essentially, I'm using 3D modeling technology to combine different forms that I find interesting. And it's really a subconscious thing for me. I'm not necessarily trying to create any specific narrative. I'm really just focusing on what is looking juicy to me, what is interesting, what is subconsciously feeding me, and that's what we end up with. But I think that this translation between the technological, the very pristine, and then the less than perfect ceramic, art of ceramics is a part of this kind of biological system that species go through, kind of like thinking about the variation that happens in individuals of a species. So these are coquina shells, which I see all the time on the beach in Pensacola, where I'm from. And then these are some forms that I created earlier this year. And I think that glaze plays a big part in this. And it's, I'm no glaze chemist, I'm not a novice at that. So I'm not very experienced with controlling it. And even when you are, it's pretty hard to. But I think that the variation in the glaze is very similar to the same thing that happens within individuals of a species. So I put all of these sculptures into surrealist installations. And I do this in an effort to have the viewer call upon different references that they may be aware of. No particular reference. I have no narrative attached to this work specifically. I'm more of wanting people to call upon multiple different references in order to reflect upon their own, just their own perspective of life, the different forms that are around us all of the time. This is Notochord's Whisper. It's a work I also made earlier this year while I was in grad school. The notochord is a vertebrae structure found in your embryo, and it is the catalyst to beginning the development of your vertebrae and it's over time. And so I'm thinking about this idea because I love growth. I love the way that geometries compile upon one another, how you start off with something very small, and through this acquisition of energy over time, you develop into the form you are now. You were once an egg and a sperm, and here we are sitting in a room together. It's just like crazy to me. It's beautiful. It's a magic. It's like the spice of life. And so this is what I'm speaking about here. And it says whisper because it's not exactly, I don't want it to be seen as a vertebrae specifically, but rather just the idea that there's a catalyst to all of this, where we have a genesis in some way, not in a biblical way, but just as like a birth. And so I use other, I employ other textures and forms upon this. Like I used kind of a glaze that was a little more calcified looking to think about fossils or, seashells, things that I'm very familiar with from living in Florida. And then, fins, which are on like a lot of different aquatic species. So along with this idea of growth, these are just a few different growth forms that I find really interesting. Of course, like mitosis, the splitting of the cell, like I was speaking about earlier, this compiling over time, this dividing and making anew, but also like growth rains on a tree in the way that we start off with a seed and over time, we're slowly evolving into something much older and perhaps wiser. And then fractals again, which we're going to talk about fractals a lot, but fractals as a geometry, but also as a philosophy, thinking about our place in the world, thinking about our own human perspective in relation to the universe at large, in relation to a larger community, in relation to Earth. I mean, we are fractaling in, we are fractaling out, fractaling down to the inside of your body, to the microbes, through your skin. I mean, there's like multiple worlds buried and beneath and above us at all times, which is magical, very cool. And so I had a residency earlier this year at Twisted Run Retreat, which is in southern Mississippi. And I got like a week, which was really nice, to stay in this cabin on this woman's property and just walk around and take photos of things that were on her property. And I spent this time as like kind of a research excursion, a period in time in which I could just take photos and then bring them back to the studio and go over them with illustration to highlight these different geometries that I was seeing, the different fractaling of the trees above me, the lichen growth over time. And I would like to note that there's not any proof at this point that lichens are growing in rings or that you can tell their age by rings, but I really like this idea of abstracting data visually. And so that's what I'm doing here with this work. So thinking about those other worlds, I've been reading this book by James Bridle, which you should all read. It's very amazing. It's about more than human intelligence and our relationship with the planet. Some of it involves AI and stuff like that, which I won't be talking about today. But this excerpt from his book really resonates with me in the work. He says, the acknowledgement of multiple other worlds, the worlds of others, is key to re-entangling ourselves with a more meaningful and compassionate cosmology. And so there's a part in this book where he's referencing another book, The Overstory by Richard Powers. And in that book, it's like a series of different short stories or little narratives about people and their relationship with trees. And there's a part in it where Richard Powers is writing about aliens, like some extraterrestrials that come to Earth, and they see us as moving very slowly. Humans are moving around like snails. And then James Bridle references that back to the way that we have a relationship with plants, which I find super interesting. The fact that we see them in slow motion all of the time is wild. And I think it creates some sort of like boundary between us and understanding their Umwelt, which is a German word for a particular organism's outlook on the world based off of their own form. And so I've done a work that is talking about this in some ways. It's called Solar Solace. And it's an aquarium that I built and planted. It's not an aquarium in this. It is an aquarium, but it's not filled with water in this. I don't think you're like going crazy or something. There's plants around the surrounding edges that will slowly grow in. And then I created a snoot, which is an object that's used in photography to channel light most of the time. And so over time, as the plants grow in towards the light, I'd keep moving the snoot down to have the plants grow in slower and slower, kind of crawling across this landscape in search of their needs, their wants. And I think that whenever I first created this piece, I was more so thinking about the geometry of the plants and the way that they would kind of crawl and web across this space. But as I've, dove deeper into this inquiry and this research, I've noticed that, of course, there's going to be a gradient of life across this tank. There's going to be ones on the edge that are dead, and then the middle is going to be more vibrant. And I think that does speak to our relationship with energy sources and our relationship with the overarching environment that, supplies us with everything we need. And so I'm still thinking about this work and how it sits in my mind, but it's something that is going to be going on for a long time and documented with a time lapse. So I'm currently actually redoing all of this. So this is like from March, but it will be done again in a different way. And in a similar fashion, I use a lot of agar, which is what's at the bottom of a Petri dish. It's a nutrient substrate. And I think I'm always fascinated with, again, like this magic trick of microbial life surrounding us in the air at all times. We're not like super aware of it because we can't see it, but it's definitely there. We're breathing it in all of the time. And so I created this work where I'm using a resin mold of tiny spheres to create little eggs, because I love, again, the idea of birth and this beginning of like having instinctual knowledge and carrying it on throughout your life. And then I used an agar that's more suited towards fungi because they make some that's for bacteria. And made this little nest, made the 3D printed nest base. And I definitely did not blow this glass because I cannot do that. But I bought this glass cloche. And what I find amazing is that as soon as you encapsulate whatever's in the air is going to be what grows into this little community that's happening. And this is before, and that's after like 2 weeks of it growing. This was at a show in LA for a little while at Art Bug Gallery, who I got curated into the show by my good peer, Katie Shanks. If Katie is here, I don't know. Love you. But I really just enjoy thinking about the ways in which these communities of fungi are working together, or, like sprawling across this landscape. And the screen really washes this out, but that's like an orange. It's supposed to be an orange. But just, yeah, thinking about the ways in which these communities are sharing information, they've been encapsulated together, and this is their new reality. Also, again, the magic trick of obtaining an energy of some sort, which would be the nutrient base, and then, flourishing and growing is wild to me. So outside of the gallery and outside of the studio, I'm also working with biological systems. Over the summer, was brought down to FCAT, which is an ecological reserve in northwestern Ecuador. They're working on restoring the Choco rainforest in the Machu Chindal Reserve. And I knew about this place whenever I came to Tulane, and it was actually an incentive for me to come to Tulane. They are connected by one of the founding members, Jordan Karubian, who I was introduced to by one of my thesis members. And I came to him and pitched him that perhaps I use some of the 3D modeling technology that I've been working with to create 3D models of some of the specimen that they have down at FCAT. And he was into it. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, about the photogrammetry. But he introduced me to Dr. J. Leighton Reed, who's an assistant professor and restoration ecologist at Virginia Tech, and Nicole Lucier, who's an ecology and evolutionary biology PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee. And these two folks are working on a project down there where they're trying to find more organic ways to reforest parts of the pastures that have been agriculturally deforested by either cacao plantations or cow pastures, that are just relying more on the ecological interactions that are happening. And I will note that FCAT has done an incredible job of trying to find different ways of restoring the forest by working with the community, the surrounding community, to understand their socioeconomic needs. Essentially, like, a lot of the people in the surrounding area are making money off of agricultural, systems. So if they can't do that, then there's no money. So you can't really go in and try to conserve something without understanding the way that the system is already working. And so a lot of them are turning to ecotourism or things like that. But essentially with this project, I was brought down there to take some photographs and make 3D models of these seeds that they're using for the restoration project. And so they can't keep the seeds over a long period of time because they're directly from the defecation of these birds, the birds that are moving in between these islands of trees, which you can see here. They're planting islands of trees in a pasture and seeing how the frugivores, which are fruit-eating birds, are moving those seeds that they brought with them and that they already had to fill in the spaces in between. So then they're misnetting, which is like it's like a tennis net type thing with a very thin kind of net material. The bird flies into it. They take the bird momentarily. The bird usually defecates because it's like, what is going on? And then you take the seed to study it and understand further about what's going on in the space. And so, of course, the seeds degrade over time. So it's like, how do we keep these? How do we create like a library for people to refer to so we don't have to keep doing this over and over and over? And also to share, kind of worldwide on the web, which we'll get into in a moment. And so when I was down there, I was put in touch with Carlos Celestia, who is he went to school for forestry engineering, and he's also the director of reforestation at FCAT. And I just have to thank him for everything. I mean, we spent a lot of time together when I was down there. Me and him were hiking at night. He was also just bringing me different seeds and fruits that were unrelated to the project I was there for, but it really meant a lot to me that he was like considering me like that. And And yeah, it was just a great time. I just really owe it all to him. He's the co-author on this project. And so what I was doing down there was photogrammetry. So it's taking a ton of different photos from all angles of an object and then compositing them into a 3D model. And so this is the very rudimentary system I had set up down there because I was traveling. We traveled from Quito, which is the capital of Ecuador, 6 hours west, by bus, and had to transfer into another car to get into the rainforest. So I was like, I really had to pack minimally. But I have a turntable here that is programmed to trigger the shutter on my camera through that cord there, that kind of like yellow red cord, and a macro lens. So I'm getting like a really close-up view of these seeds. And what happens is I get a 360 of the seed. And then I take that 360 of, each angle. I do like a top angle, a middle angle, a bottom angle, and put it into a compositing software for photogrammetry. And it takes all of these photos and creates a point cloud, which you can see it's like the salt peppery looking thing is the point cloud, and it composites them all into a 3D model. And so, and I have to, clean all that up, but this is just a little example because I've just started going through them. But all of these models will be stored on MorphoSource, which is run by Duke University. It's a 3D data repository. And I think that there's a couple different benefits to photogrammetry that are different and much further along than what I'm doing. But for this project, just having these seeds online, having a place where anybody can reach them it's public access, anybody can download them, see their specimen record, share them. I think it's very important just to advocate for conservation. But I would like to note that there's some crazy stuff being used for photogrammetry. I mean, they're monitoring the decay and the growth of coral reefs using photogrammetry to monitor the whole coral reef. I mean, it's incredible. It's really cool technology that's being developed right now that's on a much bigger scale than what I've been doing. So aside from that, oh, okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, wow. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're good. These are all the other things that I took photos of when I was down there, and I'm sorry if it's kind of like choppy and weird. But I gathered a lot of different forms while I was there, and of course I took photos of them. I threw them back out into the forest, they decay and start their whole cycle over again. But what I'm going to end up doing for my own artistic practice, aside from uploading them to MorphoSource, is having them as fodder to pull and pick apart to make new forms, and just as my own little collection of objects that I can pull from. And so it's coming to a close. But this is a work that I'm working on for the thesis presentation, or I'm sorry, the thesis show. So I hope that you all will be able to make it out to that. I'm showing with Teresa Batty, my good buddy. So it's going to be fabulous. And thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it.
All right, taking questions. I can walk over. Yeah.
Questions for me. Questions for me. Oh.
Trip to Ecuador change your mind on anything as far as your art or to enhance it or
Yeah, I would say, I mean, like, I can't think of anything specifically. But it definitely just, I mean, I'd never traveled outside of the country before, so it gave me a much wider perspective on the world and like what else is going on outside of the deep south of the United States. So I would say in that way, it was very eye-opening. Also, that part of Ecuador is extremely biodiverse. So I was seeing like a ton of different forms that I had never been exposed to before. It was almost like overstimulating. And I took a lot of photos that I didn't include in here, just of like the landscape and different like close-ups of bugs and things like that. So I would say, yeah, just like being able to see what is possible was wild. It was very cool.
I have a question.
What? Who is that?
That's Donata.
Oh, it's Donata. You can go, Donata.
All right. So I would just love to hear you elaborate maybe a little bit more. Like you documented so many beautiful different forms of seeds. I'm just wondering if you took any other, can you hear me okay?
Kind of. 1 second, we're fixing it. Okay. Try again.
All right. So you
Yes.
did such a beautiful documentation of all those diverse seeds in Ecuador.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on maybe perhaps if you anticipate using that as like further points of inspiration moving ahead, like you've talked about fractals and all this inspiration in nature. I mean, seeds as like this reproductive launching point. Like, do you see kind of integrating some more of those seeds into the future? I'm just curious. You put so much work into that. I would just love to hear.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely wanting to have some sort of programming around that project, whether it be in the thesis show or aside from that. There will be some ceramic work that comes out of those different forms, just the seeds themselves, not even like pulled apart or anything, just the actual 3D models of the seeds, maybe stacked in big piles or displayed in some fashion. But yes, certainly. Thank you, Donata.
Okay, now you can really hear me. So I know that you had some really interesting night hikes that you went on at FCAT. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those and maybe if the experiences that you had in these night hikes might enter into your work at some point, or maybe already has.
Yes, Jake, perhaps we did take a night hike together in Ecuador. Yes, so I went on a lot of night hikes with my good buddy Jake, who I met in Ecuador. And that was, I love wearing a headlight. I'm just gonna say it. I love wearing a headlight. Wearing a headlight is really fun, you guys. And so like wearing the headlight in the forest was so, again, just kind of visceral, and seeing like the details of everything was super wild. And so I don't know, it kind of, especially taking photos there, because I've always had a dream like as a little child of like being a National Geographic photographer and things like that. And that really, like, the dream came true. Of course, I'm not like employed by them or anything like that, but like for myself and my own collection, like just having the photos that we were taking, it was just like super wild. I don't know specifically though if I'm going to recreate an installation of a night hike, but maybe that maybe that could be something too. But yeah, definitely, like, I mean, I will say we went on one night hike. We left at 8:30 p.m. and just completely lost track of time and didn't get back to the research station until 2:30 in the morning, which was super wild. But it was just like you just kept getting like hit with like different things. You were seeing different snakes and bugs and like hearing monkeys and just like all of this different sort of stuff. So yeah, I definitely want to return and go somewhere like that many more times in my life.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, Billy.
So when you talk about fractals, like in skin and the antlers and the other examples you gave, I'm wondering, like, do you have any desire to like explain the parallel occurrences, or is your work really just about exploring and enjoying those parallel occurrences?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think there was a point in time when I first got here that my mind was thinking really black and white, and I was really invested in like trying to understand things in a more scientific way, or maybe just like in a more reasonable, factual way. And over the program, I have gotten to the point where I feel like that wasn't benefiting me. I felt like I was going down a rabbit hole of existence, and it was really like stifling me in my work. And so now it feels as though like perhaps I'll lean on that sometimes, but it feels more abstract in that way, definitely just exploring and like looking and seeing what I'm taking in.
Hey, Grace.
Hey, Patrick.
Can you speak to your use of the 3D Potter bot to create these forms instead of using a more traditional hand process or hand building process to make these forms?
Yeah, and so let's do a little rewind here. Wait, actually, maybe it'll take forever to do the rewind. Yeah, so I really, like I was talking about before, this technological side of things in parallel with the more material is very satisfying to me, thinking that I'm creating something on the screen that isn't necessarily going to turn out the way that I think it's going to because of the material, clay is exciting. I read a book by Enrico Cohen called The Art of Genes, and he was speaking about the ways in which he thinks that creation or this idea of growth and new beginnings, the way that our we come to be is very similar to the way that artists work, which I was like, wow, that's wild. But I also think it speaks to, in a similar way, the way that I'm creating these in a computer and they're coming out in a different way than maybe I had intended. And then as well, like the glaze is always very interesting, but that's aside from the hand building part of things. But my collaboration with technology in general has been weird. I use technology a lot of times, and I'm still trying to explore what the ecology of technology is, our relationship as humans with technology in the grander scheme of the world, if that kind of answers your question. Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask about something you said at the beginning or closer to the beginning when you were talking about your work where you mentioned the kind of surreal aspect. And I'm very curious because much of what you later discuss is more kind of ecological, logical. And I'm wondering, do you envision in the future moving into the realm of the fantastical and the surreal in the ways that other artists do, and using your research as a way to then to develop more site-specific things that draw upon this for inspiration, but in fact allow you to facilitate the kind of more fantastical reality that you would present? Or was that some other way that you're thinking about the surreal?
What you so much. I love that question. I've actually lately been thinking a lot about, like, of course, for my thesis show, I'm preparing it for a gallery because that's, what has to happen. But I have been thinking a lot about the installations that I'm doing with the ceramic, specifically. Oh, we're past it. The pendulum forms being somewhere out in the wilderness or somewhere that, whoopsie. Okay, we're almost there. Okay. Somewhere that they could exist in that may not seem as, because in the gallery, it's like, I like that they're not being inhibited upon by any reference of an environment, but I also think it would be very interesting to employ that narrative in kind of a juxtaposition way. So I have been thinking about in the future doing more of that. And I also, the two sides of things, like me using biological systems and then me also creating like these forms, I want to find a way that they can be combined at some point in time, but perhaps that's not the time right now. But I do think about that a lot, if that answers your question. Thank you.
You might have time for one more. Any on Zoom?
Gigi, you got something to say? Oh, we do. Oh my God.
I think what you were saying towards the end of the previous question, like starts in on the question that I had. I noticed like a strategy of isolation in a lot of the work, like negative space seems to really play a pivotal role in helping us see a form, or there's a very kind of determined negative space in which we see the shape. And so I'm wondering like how what you see negative space standing in for, or what your what's your as you think about sort of a larger narrative, what role that isolation or space plays?
I love that question too. Thank you, Aaron. And it directly, yeah, it goes into the question we just had. I think that and I've spoken to this with Deanna recently, the relationship the negative space has to the work, I think, is that if I were to put it somewhere where it was surrounded by other references, perhaps outside of the gallery, I feel like a narrative would arise that I didn't necessarily prescribe the work. So I feel that it's important in some ways, but like I was saying, I also want to break out of that at some point. I don't know. I don't want to have any, like, create some kind of like fantasy novel like moment. It's more just kind of like an existential, like, what is happening here, type of thing, if that answers your question. Good. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Request for some zooming in with the camera, so please hold one moment. You will get to see. Oh, I just noticed.